Now, the ancient magical arts go very, very far back. They're part of shamanic arts, the art of the shaman. The Egyptian books of the dead, which was not just a book, it's just a collection of a lot of Egyptian material, was material that was used both for initiation of priests and because they went through a simulation of death in their initiation. And in shamanism, that's always true. The shaman basically dies and comes back, or he has to experience all the diseases himself before he's able to help other people and all that sort of thing. You all know about that, being therapists. You get to have all the horrible things, and then you find your way out. Now you've got the keys to help other people. But the Egyptian books of the dead were also used to train people for how to die and death and dying, and there was a great deal of magical work associated with it because it had to do with subtle things. These were basically memorized rehearsals for passing through the guardians who guarded the different areas or spheres, or lokas, as we would say in Sanskrit, or there were different ideas, but the different kinds of places that one went in death. And learning how to get through these passages and how to do this was the knowledge of the priests. And this, I'm giving you this now because later on it becomes very important as we get into the more astrological developments that happen in magic and angel magic and so on. And so they memorize just long things, just like you do if you're becoming a Freemason. You memorize all this stuff, or at least you used to. They memorized the things that would get them through these different levels. And they were usually a memorization that said, identified yourself with the deity. You say, I am Horus, I am the son of Osiris, I am this and that, let me through because I this or that. In the name of so-and-so, let me through. And that's where this in the name of stuff started coming from. And then also, in order to decide how far you got, you went into the court of Ma'at, justice, and your heart was weighed against a feather. And if your heart was heavy in any way, which is because of the concept of sin or of guilt and things like that, then you were not able to pass even beyond. And you would, in later traditions, you would be reborn. And in some traditions, in some Egyptian traditions, there was an Egyptian hell. You would walk along a path to go from one place to another, and if your heart was light, the path would be wide and easy to traverse, but if your heart was all heavy, then it would be thin as a razor and you would fall off and all that sort of thing. So to get power over these guardian deities, you knew their names. It was knowledge. It was the knowledge of the names, the proper knowledge. It was priestly knowledge. And you identified yourself with Horus, who was like Christ, like, you know, Christ inside of you and so on. Now, there are also other traditions of magic that we find in the Greek tradition, and we have the Egyptian books of the dead and all the magical traditions that came down with that for illness and for after death and things like that, and for communication with the person after death, the preservation of the Ka, and so on. We also had Greek traditions of magic, and the most famous were women's traditions, and you found them in Thrace. The Thracian witches were so powerful. They were experts on the use of herbs and things like this, but they were considered to be so powerful and so dangerous that if a male warrior was able to kill one, he was a great hero. So that was the model we have for some of the, you know, classic witches of the classics, like Circe and so on. And as I said, a warrior who killed a witch would be considered to be a hero. There are lots of other liturgies that developed in Mithraism and so on to have visions. For example, to see the midnight sun, what was called the midnight sun. You see, when the sun went down, it went down into the underworld. The underworld was divine underworld. You could make a passage to the divine underworld through the knowledge that was given in the Pythagorean and other earlier priestly traditions where the heaven was under the earth. That's called chthonic traditions. And there were many liturgies for people to be able to go into caves or at nighttime and to be able to make contact with the divine world, and especially with Apollo, who was connected with the sun, and see what was called the midnight sun, which was the vision of Apollo, where you would receive oracles and so on. You can find them in the Greek magical papyri and so on. There are a whole collection of Greek and late Egyptian magical liturgies and practices and things for everything from making someone fall in love with you to making someone die and all that kind of stuff in the Greek and demotic magical papyri. When I was a student at Episcopal Theological School, which is now called the Episcopal Divinity School, and Harvard Divinity School, I would go to the library, the Harvard Library, and there I could find the Greek and demotic magical papyri, but they were still in Greek and demotic and with some translations by scholars, very hard to find in dusty little places in the library. Now they've been published. I think it was 10 years ago that one of the scholars I knew published them, and they're actually accessible for study and so on. But they are written on papyri, just like all papyruses and manuscripts of old manuscripts of the New Testament and things, are many of them written on papyri paper. And you can now get these things translated by Hans Betz, who was a good scholar who's translated them and made them very clear. It's not that expensive. The Greek magical papyri is just a paperback you can buy for 15 or 18 or 20 bucks or something if you want to learn about the ancient magical things. Here is an example of an oneiropompus, a dream bringer. Here's a request for a dream oracle. With myrrh, you write on a clean papyrus, I call you, the one who shines on the whole inhabited and uninhabited world, whose name is composed of 30 letters, in which are the 7 vowels through which you name the universe, gods, lords, blah, 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 magical names. These are what are called the 7 divine powerful vowels and so on. Lords concerning such and such and such, and these are all magical names that have numerical values, just like you find in Sanskrit and in Hebrew and so on. This is how the Greek Kabbalah, Greek Kabbalistic, and that was in fact that preceded Hebrew Kabbalah and the letter mysticism and so on. So these are divine names, and you write the name composed of 30 letters in 2 wing formations, as it's shown here. And then you put it under a lamp and you go to sleep, and after pure condition means you've bathed and all this sort of thing, and then you will get you'll get an answer. This is a dream bringer. We all did a dream bringer when we were initiated into THG as one thing that we did. We also we scrayed and did some other things too. Note that there's an intonation of powerful divine names. Those names are meant to be intoned. They're not just written down. So the way those names are intoned, the sound that comes out in those names is through the vowels. So the 7 mighty and powerful vowels, and the Greek 7 vowels, were intoned in certain kinds of ways. So we have a wisdom seminar on harmonic intoning if you want to go more deeply into all that sort of stuff. Also, when I was in graduate school, I was able to get a hold of a book called, this book, Sefer Haratzim, the Book of the Secrets Hebrew, which is I've made available now on my website. A fellow named Margaliot, who was a Jewish scholar, had recovered in Cairo what were called Ganitza treasures, which were ancient Jewish magical traditions. Now, modern rabbis and scholars didn't want to accept that Jews had anything to do with astrology. Well, they were the most famous astrologers of the past, of the ancient world, or alchemy. They were the founders of Alexandrian alchemy. And magic and theurgy, well, they were the people you want to learn that stuff. But no, we don't have anything to do with that, because ever since Moses Maimonides, the dangers that Jewish communities had from pogroms and so on in Europe, they were being accused of being witches and things like this, so they wanted to disassociate themselves with all that sort of thing. But in fact, there is a great Jewish magical tradition, and Margaliot had collected a lot of this stuff, and nobody had published it, and so I was able to get a hold of it, and I got the help also of a Hebrew scholar. We went through all the stuff, and I wrote some stuff about it, which is available now. So that's an online book that I have also if you're interested in ancient Jewish magical practices. It's called Sefer Haratzim and its traditions. And so if you're interested, you can get that and read about that kind of stuff. Now, before we go any further, I want to talk a little bit about Plato, because Plato and his ideas, which really, Plato was a Pythagorean initiate. He was initiated in Pythagoreanism, and he was quite a mystic, and a lot of people have just recently, the last 15 years in classical studies, started to recognize how deeply involved the Socratic philosophers were in mysticism, and Plato was very deeply involved. But I want to give you a little version of Plato's allegory of the cave, which is told in the Republic, in the 7th book of the Republic. He says that this is a world of illusion, just as you find in Sanskrit, a world of Maya, a mirrored world, a shadow play in human minds. And so Plato thought that, conceived of there being three worlds. There were the sensible natural world which we exist in today, and then there was the supernatural or intelligible world, which we don't see with our eyes. We only understand and sense with finer senses within ourselves. And then even a higher world beyond that, which is the world of the archetypal forms and things. The world, and the way you would know things here, images, ikasia, you will see them, you'll get the form of the image on your eyes. In fact, the idea of the theory of seeing in those days was not that, was that the object, the eye put out an energy that went against an object and then came back to you. And there were many ideas. And then things, that you were aware of, the objects represented things. When you saw the form of a female or a woman, for example, you trusted, pistis, you believed that there was a woman there, although it could be a hallucination. And that's the material world. So there are two levels of that. One is what you perceive, and then what the perception as an object represents to you. And then there was a higher form, things that were mathematical, theoretical, and things that we call the forms. These can be related to the Kabbalistic worlds as well. And you understood things like mathematics and things like that by understanding dianoia. And when you don't see them, you just understand them. It's a theoretical thing. And forms, the actual realities, the more general things behind all that, you perceive through a higher, through what's called your nous, N-O-U-S, which is your higher mind, higher manas, you would say in Sanskrit. And it was called, to understand that, it was called noesis. But there was even beyond that, of which there was no mode of knowing, was the divine reality that stood behind all these three worlds. So this is what represented a kind of a Pythagorean mysticism that lay behind a lot of Plato's ideas. And you were, if your soul was able to take flight and ascend into the higher worlds, you would come into awareness of these things, but you would start losing the images and the forms, and finally it just was pure gnosis, pure knowledge, pure knowing. So, as I've explained, these different levels of knowing and knowledge were ways that things had been understood. Now, as you know, Socrates asked questions, and Plato was a student of Socrates. And Socrates would ask people questions about, well, what is virtue? What is the good? What is not good? And all this, and how do you know? And all sort of thing. And so the questions of how you know things and what you can know and what you can't know and the means through which you know them was a very important thing. And this is important in all mysticism and philosophies about what kind of knowledge there is. So he maintained, and this did most of the Greek mystics, that incarnate beings like us are limited to images of shadows of what real reality is. The issue, if you want to know what's really real, you can't tell just with your eyes. And so he compared people to prisoners in a cave who were forced by chains to look straight ahead. And here's the prisoner chained in the cave, and up here is a fire. This fire, and here's a person who's holding up an image, an object, but it's not the real object, it's just a shape. And then the shadow of that shape goes on the wall here, and this fellow perceives it. And that's what we are, that's what our perception is. But this world is not a real world. The real world is out here. This is the true sun, which we can't see with our eyes, and this is the sun we see with our eyes. So if we look at this, the real world is outside. We're like people dumbed out in front of a TV set. We have a warped, limited perception of in the trance of incarnate life, and the images we see are 3 times removed from reality. They're all as though all perceptions are just shadows like that on the wall that you're looking at, and of models, which are called idoli, or idols, based on forms of reality. The reality is elsewhere, and it's held in front of a fire. That is how we see anything with light from the sun, but that's not the true sun. And so this is the image. Well, it's kind of, this model is not a real thing. Like this is a picture of a cow. This is a shadow of a cow. This is a model of a cow. That's what material life is. That's what a material cow is. Your perception of the cow and the cow itself. But the cow, that's not the real cow. The real cow is a sacred being. And his form comes from a much higher world, and all cows participate in that form. So that the individual cow that you see and you slaughter, you milk, or whatever you do with, is all down at this real dummy level of being, insubstantial. So the philosopher realizes the dilemma, and he breaks his shackles and starts to make his way upward to the opening of the cave to go out to see what the real world is. And at first, when he gets out of the entrance here, he's blinded by the real sun, and he staggers around like a drunk, and it's like compared to the ecstasy that the philosophers or the mystics have when they have a vision of reality. And the prisoners all think he's a fool, because he can't really explain what he's seeing, what he's doing, and he sounds like a jerk to them and all that sort of thing. And he tries to tell them about the real world that's out there, and eventually they all kill the philosopher. Now this is called Plato's allegory of the cave. And of course the great philosopher he was talking about was his teacher, Socrates, who was forced to drink the hemlock and choose between killing himself that way or leaving Athens forever and being cast out. So this is his allegory of the cave. The reason I'm showing it to you is because it's a very important thing as we go into the magical traditions, that magical traditions presuppose this kind of understanding of what is really real and what really isn't real. The Hermetic magical thing, as above, so below, that what we see in the earth are little models and things that are created by higher realities, and there is a hierarchy of reality. So Socrates, however, is not the originator of all this sort of thing. He himself was also initiated as a Pythagorean, and this goes back way tradition. Now, theurgical operations are interactions, liturgical interactions you have with higher beings and higher realms. And they were developed especially by the Neo-Pythagoreans. After the time of Pythagoras, Pythagoras is 6th, 7th century BC. We now get into the time of the Neo-Pythagoreans and finally the Neoplatonists in the early Christian era. If you've done the initiatic mysteries of classical antiquity, you might remember the full archoi. Pythagoras was a full archoi. He was a priest who would take people on trips to the divine underworld. It was take about 3 days, and you lay down like a lion in a lair in a cave, and then you were guided by the full archos, and people were taken into the divine underworld. It was to see the king of the divine underworld was known as Hades or Pluto. His wife was Penelope, who was the daughter of Demeter. It's all part of the Eleusinian mysteries, etc. And so under the earth is where heaven was, and that's where people went, and they went to the Elysian fields and so on under the earth. And that kind of guiding of people into the death experience and then the return from the death experience to have visions about how they would, about themselves, is all in the section we did in Initiatic Mysteries on oracles, and we did it on the Delphian Oracle and many of the other oracles. So the soul itself would descend into the divine underworld, which is what the ancient concept of heaven was. And by the time of the post-Christian period, we get into Plotinus and the Platonists, and his students Proclus and Porphyry and so on, it was no longer a divine descent of the soul into the underworld. It was a divine ascent of the soul into the higher worlds of Plato, and that Plato had understood. And that was because of the coming and the importance of astrology and the understanding of the many heavens and so on. It was very linked to the development of Hebrew soul ascent and so on in the Merkaba mysteries and so on. So one of the most important students of this was a fellow named Iamblichus. And Iamblichus wrote a book called De Mysteriis, concerning the mysteries, in which he talks about the information he gets from an Egyptian hierophant. And by this time, we're probably talking about a Hermetic hierophant, because the Egyptian government is all gone now. It's all as it used to exist, the old kingdoms, and they've been taken over by the descendants of Alexander the so-called Great, who now are running Egypt, the Ptolemies. That's who Cleopatra was and all those people. And these people who understood the Egyptian mysteries for oracles and ascent of the soul, etc., were people who informed Iamblichus, and that became part of the Neoplatonic idea of the ascent of the soul. Why did you want to ascend? Well, the same reason the philosopher wants to come out of the cave. You want to get a communion with the higher worlds and with the divine worlds and with your own higher nature for advice and guidance and inspiration in this life, and as a rehearsal for your own death. So you can get this in translation, in copies of Iamblichus's On the Mysteries. This is the one I recommend because it's the most recent one and the best translation that really understands what he's talking about. Basically, he talks about how one invokes or calls down the higher divine beings in order to have oracles and control elemental forces. Theurgy means literally working with divine things, divine or godlets or gods. And theurgical operations were criticized philosophically by non-Neoplatonistic philosophers very often, saying, well, you can't control the gods. Why can humans control the gods? That's not right. Humans have to obey the gods. Well, you might recall that even in the New Testament, Paul says that, don't you know that human beings will judge the angels? That the angels were beings created by deity to do certain things, but that human beings ultimately will be higher than the angels. And this was the kind of idea you had in Platonism, which is a Neoplatonic thought, which is 200-300 years later. The idea that human beings are in fact they hold the spark of the God, the highest God in them. So they have the right to, in certain circumstances, to get the cooperation of these angelic beings or these higher beings. So one of the great writers of Egypt was Manetho, who wrote the Egyptica. I'm going to show you a little bit how hard it is to get back to there. The original thing is written about the 3rd century before the Christian era, and then it was altered by pro and anti-Jewish editors. Why pro and anti? Because there were a lot of Jewish practices, including Merkaba mysticism and so on, that used some of the techniques of the Egyptians. And then we have, by the 1st century, we have Josephus and different kinds of things, and it's preserved mainly because it's a short history of all the rulers and the reigns of the Egyptians, and the esoteric information in it is not preserved as well. And then finally, by the time we get down to the Neo-Pythagoreans, we have some pretty garbled information. But these are the kind of sources that are used by the Neoplatonists to put together the philosophy of how you do this higher form of magic, which we will call theurgy. It was very connected to Babylonian astrological operations and magic, and Hermetic hierarchies, and Hebrew angelology, especially the Apocalypse of Enoch and the Enochian apocalypses. Merkaba mysticism we've mentioned. Now, the idea was for the soul to ascend to the highest heaven in order to receive instruction and oracles and so on. And that soul ascent was the main purpose of the theurgical. Full oracle did just what the did when they took people on a 3-night journey into the divine underworld to gain illumination and so on. It was the same thing, except it was now going into the upper worlds, because that's where heaven is now. And this becomes the medieval representation of what is done. Because in medieval times, theurgy develops out of iamblichus and iamblican ideas, which would be considered by some to be cheap magic and others to be very high mystical practices. This is a representation of porphyry. It's a medieval representation of illuminated manuscriptness in the 3rd century, who is one of the Neo-Platonic century, teaching the ascent traditions, going through angels and things like that in the Christian. And at the very best, one wanted guidance from what in the Greeks called the algoides, which is the golden image, which is your we might call your highest self, your monadic self, your higher nature, and was also known in these traditions as your guardian angel or your solar angel. And so that in the traditions that we have in the early medieval period, which are Jewish, even Sufi traditions and others, in fact, this is a Sufi image of one being assisted by his higher self. This knowledge of the divine names and how what the inner mysterious invisible structure of the higher heavens would give you the power to summon their presence to help you to make these connections. So that was the idea of what theurgy was all about. This is going a little back a little further. This is from the Greek magical papyri. This is Demnemnius. He is a representation of the 7 powerful vowels that were used in Thrace and other places. You might notice you've got 7 vowels: a long O, U, O, I, E, A. This is Sabaoth. This is another name of the highest God. And that going up the spine are these different vowels. And if you look at how the vowels are set, they go from a high sound to a low sound, and from a low sound to a high sound. So the knowledge and use of the vowels can be very much coordinated to the kind of use that we make of vowels in harmonic intoning and so on. Now we have to talk about the fallen angels and the demons. So in the 6th century before the Christian era, all the people who could read and were literate after the Jews were conquered by the Babylonians, the Persians, were taken captivity all the way over to Babylon, which is a very far place to go. And the reason for that is, instead of massacring them, they respected them as aristocrats, but they wanted to root out the possibility of their coming back any new kind of nation of Judaism without all their priests and their literate people, etc. And they left as just the people of the land. And a lot from the Babylonian priests. They learned priests, the magi, the Zoroastrian priesthood. And the Zoroastrians were the ones that had developed the science of astrology very, very far, and especially the astrology with the planets and not just with the ascendants and so on. And so they were exposed to the Babylonian pantheon of gods and knew the names of the gods and their characteristics. Now, when finally permission was granted for under Ezra and Nehemiah for a Jewish outpost to be established back in Jerusalem, and for the temple to be rebuilt, but not the walls to be rebuilt. But they, of course, violated that right away and rebuilt the walls, and they eventually rebuilt Israel. Book of Genesis, book today we know as the book of Genesis, which tells the Jewish creation myth, which is actually one of the latest bits of Jewish Hebrew mythology, was a creation story that that was set to offset the Babylonian creation story, which is about 2,000 years older. In the Babylonian creation story, the gods, not one god, but the council of the gods, sit together, and they don't speak a word to make light. The light radiates from their bodies. They create the world in 7 days, and they do it in exactly the same order as the Jewish order, except it's a 2,000-year-older story. And when man is created, he's not created by a breath being breathed into him like they do with Adam and so on, but there's a god is killed, and his blood, he's a good god, and he's killed by a bad god, and the blood of the good god comes down into the dust, and from that is built the human being, etc. So the Jewish priests say, okay, well, that's sort of how it was, but actually there was only one God. He's the one God who's above all the other gods. By the way, the Jewish belief was not monotheism, it was henotheism. Jews accepted all kinds of gods, so they just were lower than their God. They were lower in the courts, lower in the God system. And so they said, and this one God who created things didn't have a light radiate from him. He spoke it. He said, fiat lux in Latin. He said, let there be light. And there was light. So he just spoke the word. By the word of his mouth and the breath of his mouth, he created light. Then he made a firmament and did all these things. And then finally, when he makes a human being, he does it by breathing into him, inbreathing into him, and so on. So it's the same story with the good old Jewish modifications to make it work for a Jewish religion. And we call that the Genesis creation story. And there was a great deal of learning that went back and forth and exchange that happened between the Jews and the Babylonians at that time. And one of the things you'll find in the Jewish creation story in Genesis is that God made the lights in the heavens for signs and seasons and interpretations. In other words, for astrology, astrological purposes. This is the first time we hear in any literature, any Hebrew literature, a real mention of astrology. But that's becomes a very major thing in Judaism after that. This is the Enuma Elish. This is the Babylonian creation myth, if you ever want to get it. It's the original. Now, the Jewish priests were by the highest God. And or angels. Angels are deities whose names end in El, which means God, like Mikael, Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel, etc. These are the major holy malachim. So these are these were originally Babylonian deities. So Michael and Raphael and all that, if you go back real far, you'll find them hanging out in Babylon. They had certain functions that they did. In fact, what the four major archangels were supposed to have done is to taken up positions at the four directions of the universe to hold down the fallen angels so they can't come back and overrun things. Very amazingly like the Greek myth of Tartarus and the great battle between the giants who were finally overcome by Zeus and his people and held and bound underground so they couldn't come up and take over things, etc. And the fallen angels, the fallen malachim, who had rebelled against God's rule under Satanael, here about the 2nd century. Beings all have the same pedigree, basically. Being So here's one representation of the fall of Satan and his angels being pushed out of heaven by Michael and his angels and falling onto earth. And when they come onto earth, what do? They seduce the daughters of men, and they eventually make things so bad they become the cause of the Noachic flood, etc. But they also can teach divine sciences and knowledge that the human beings don't have. And the ones that can learn from the fallen angels are the ones who will be the magicians and the sorcerers and the scientists and all those other kinds of people, the geeks, And the fallen angels had intercourse with human women to produce a race of giants called the Nephilim, which is a word that means the fallen. And that caused the Noachic flood. And in the book of Enoch, the grimoires taught the forbidden sacred sciences. They were angels, so they knew all these things that humans didn't know. They were the Babylonian arts and sciences, really. And they were known, then eventually they were subdued by those who would watch over them so they wouldn't become a problem again, called the Watchers. So fallen angels were given Babylonian names like Beelzebub, the Lord of the Flies, and they were transformed into daimonia, which doesn't mean demons, it means little gods, but later it came to mean demons. And they would possess people and animals and things later on as little demons. There's a whole extensive Jewish angelology and demonology that develops just before the time of Jesus. In the New Testament, you'll find Jesus saying, I saw Satan fall from heaven like a bolt of lightning, etc. The word Lucifer, by the way, was a word that was stuck in during the Latin translation, which is the Catholic translation by St. Jerome called the Vulgate, and it means the bearer of light, because supposedly before his fall he was Uriel, he was the bearer of God's light, and after his fall he became the demonic light, and so he was called Lucifer, the bearer of light. Because you see in a book like Job, which is written in the 5th, 4th, 3rd centuries, it's written over a period of time because it's got sections that are added to it. There's no fallen angels, and Satanael, or Satan, or Lucifer as they translate it in Latin, is a member of the court. He's the prosecuting attorney. He's the guy that brings the case against people to try their souls. And God says, okay, go ahead and try his soul, but he'll be faithful to me and all that kind of stuff. So the angels don't fall in Hebrew concepts until about the 3rd century or 2nd century. They become very, very important. So I've talked about the Greek myth of the Titans being chained beneath the earth to trouble humanity. The Titans, that whole area is tectonic. There's lots of earthquakes and volcanoes, and under the earth, beasts under the earth. One way that was looked upon, there were beasts finally conquered and chained under the earth, and that was the beginning of the idea of the underworld becoming hell, becoming a bad place rather than a divine underworld. So here we have a little picture of the conquest of the Titans that is very similar, I think you'll find, to the fall of the angels. So Satanael and his minions were assigned to the ancient Greek heaven, which is the divine underworld, and the realm of Hades, which was the god of, another name for Hades was Pluto, the god of wealth, where the corn came from and all these things. But now he becomes Hades, meaning a very bad place, filled with fire and brimstone. And so eventually we get these images. Under the world is where the place of punishment is, in hell and fire. And Lucifer, Satan, all live under there, and all the evil angels and all the angels that are set forth to try and tempt men and so on are under the earth. I'm going to give you a little video history of this, and we're going to be seeing some sections of a tape by a fellow named Pope Runyon, who has got an MA in something, I think English, and he's actually the head of the Temple of Astarte in Los Angeles. And he's will be eventually demonstrating to us a lot of these techniques. It's a very good private film I got from him. Now, by the time we get to the medieval period, there is a whole bunch of legends and names and things for the satanic hosts. The satanic hosts, however, have knowledge. They can be summoned and they can teach people this knowledge. And so they were summoned by not only by Jewish but Christian and Islamic magic workers. And they wrote what were called grimoires. A grimoire means a grammar or a magical reference book that would be used by a magus or a magus. The word goes back to the magi of the Zoroastrians. Here's one example of a grimoire which we still have. The Clavicle of Solomon, which is a very important grimoire that's being used, that still is used. And it would tell you the names of the angels and the sigils, the magical alphabets that could be used, the seals, the operations that could be done, and explain how your oratory or temple was to be. Notice that outside the magical circle, so the macrocosmic magical circle of creation is drawn for protection from the demons who are outside the circle. The archangels are invoked for divine authority. So invocation means bringing something down to you. It's within you as well, but you're invoking it as though it's outside of you. So here we have the angel that's invoked, and he's the good guy. And he will oversee from above because he has power and authority over all these demons. And then you evoke from among the fallen angels to send out servants, which are elementals and demons and things, to do the opus or the work of the operation, because they're the ones that do it. They're the ones that are responsible for all the things that go on in this plane. So under the authority of this guy, these guys can be sent out to do this work. And this is the script for the operation. So they appear outside of the magical circle, and the fallen angels, which are really just ancient deities that are transformed, are ugly and terrible and powerful and dangerous, and you have to make sure you're protected from them. For example, Amun, who is a very evil spirit, is from the Egyptian Amun, and this is the way he's represented in medieval iconography. Ashtoreth was the Canaanite Astarte, and Ashtoreth is represented in many different ways, and sometimes can be a cat and things like this, and has bad breath and all that kind of stuff. This is another medieval drawing of Ashtoreth. Asmodeus is from the Persian Aishma Diva, and is portrayed in medieval grimoires this way. This is what he's going to look like when you call him up. Now, if we look at what we call angelology and demonology of the who's who of all this, there are 7 archangels for the planets and the days in the Enochian tradition. That's the Greek in a early representation with some saints and so on. You can click on these names if you're doing this online, and it'll take you to the Wikipedia descriptions of each of them. But they are Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, Uriel, which comes from Oriel, which means the light of God, Sariel, Raguel, and Remiel. But there are other lists of the 7 in other places. Zadkiel, Jophiel, Haniel, and Chamuel are also listed as archangels in different other kinds of grimoires. And Ophaniel and others are found in some of the magical papyri. Now, there are 4 archangels of the seasons and the directions. Spring is Raphael, and Raphael really means healer of God or healing of God, and it's connected with spring, where things are renewed. Summer is Uriel, the light of God, when you have the most light. Autumn is Michael. When the light begins to dim, and you have to prepare for the winter and for all the negative forces of the winter. And then in winter, Gabriel. Gabriel is the revealer. Remember, it's in the winter that Gabriel is associated with the giving of the revelation to the Virgin Mary and so on. These four angels are the four angels of the quarters, the four quarters. They're the most powerful ones that are usually used in these traditions. In the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, if you face east, you say, "Before me, Raphael, behind me," in the west, Gabriel on my right, Michael, and on my left, Uriel, and so on. And these are where these directions come from. And the angelic hierarchy, we have many different hierarchies. This is from Maimonides and from the Zohar. We have the Malachim, which are the messengers, the angels of God, and etc., the Seraphim, the Hayot, the sacred beasts, the Ophanim, etc., and down, and the Cherubim, etc. And there are many different. But the archangels are thought of as in Beria, which is the second highest world, although in some traditions they're in Yetzirah. And the angels themselves that they command are considered to be in Yetzirah, although in some traditions Asiya. So the lower angels carry out specific functions of the cosmos and the elementals, etc. Now the angels are commanded by the major angels that answer to the archangels. It's a chain of command. Now the satanic hosts are beneath the moon. They're sublunary. They're connected with the earth and the underworld, and they're in the air. So they're all around the place we live, in the air and the sea and the underworld. And interestingly, all the satanic forces are considered to be male. Well, that tells you something, I suppose. They're all princes, but you invoke certain of these demons for specific purposes. And these are the seals of these demons. Now, there are 72 of them that connected with that were supposedly imprisoned in the brass vessel by Solomon, etc. But each has a specific kind of sigil. We're going to explain what that means in a while. Cornelius Agrippa was the first person that really put all this together for people in the West in the 16th century. This is about a century, this is about 80 years before the time that Shakespeare was writing and so on. It was called De Occulta Philosophia. He had lots of graphical tables and symbolic drawings by Hermetic printing craftsmen, whose esoteric understanding was essential for all this and for all the coming Hermetic Renaissance and Rosicrucian Enlightenment. Who were these people? They were the Albigensian Cathari, who had been butchered and had scattered in a diaspora all across Europe, and they then specialized in these kinds of arts. And they were the ones who would later be relied upon to make all these occult diagrams and things like that. This is what one modern copy of his book looks like. It talks about the macrocosm and the microcosm within man. And it was a Hermetic and a Kabbalistic synthesis of magic, astrology, chiromancy, Christian Kabbalah, the celestial alphabet, the planetary seals, theurgy, medicine, the occult properties of plants, rocks, and metals, and the human microcosmic soul. And so Cornelius Agrippa's De Occulta Philosophia became one of the great reference books for the grimoires. Greek letters, Hebrew letters, and Latin letters were used as special alphabets, numerological alphabets. I have to explain that the first mystical alphabet was the Greek alphabet, and it was from that Jewish Kabbalists developed the Hebrew mystical alphabet that you will see in some of the earliest examples of Jewish Kabbalah, but there was also a Latin form of Kabbalah. So you will find diagrams that relate the different quarters of the person to the horoscope, different parts of the body. This is the way horoscopes were drawn back then. They're still drawn that way in some places. to the different parts of the hand, to relationships and correlations of things. All this is in Cornelius Agrippa's concerning occult. Also, the planetary symbols in numerology were developed, were codified at that time, and we're talking about there, but they had been around, and people had known them in all kinds of different ways and different things. But here's a place where they were all put together, and what kinds of characters are used to represent different astrological parts of the human body, etc. And the Hebrew alphabet as it was used also in magical traditions. Now, a magical alphabet was a means of communicating with the angels. Some people say it developed from the asterisms in the sky. There was a star here, a star here, and a star here, and this could make a constellation. It can also make a letter. And so that seems to be where some of the first sigils of the first angels developed, by connecting stars in the sky and saying this is Raphael's quarter, etc. It got to be more complicated. These are some of the sigils, and these are some of the this is the letter Sheen. They're always sealed at the end. The end of each line with a little round thing, so no force can come out of it, nothing can be lost, everything will be trapped in it. And there are Hebrew versions of it, and there are many other versions of it. A sigil is something that is another way of connecting with divine forces besides the name, but if you use the sigil and the name, you get a better connection. Now let's take a look at this. This is a drawing of the human microcosm. We see from the heart right here, from the center here, going out in the quarters and the directions, really 8 directions, 8 quarters. We have connections that are made, and they are lettered and they're numbered. This became the basis for the Rosicrucian Hebrew letter numbering of the rose that's in the center of the cross. And I'm going to show you how that was used to create sigils, this part right here. This is what it looks like if we take it out. Here are the Hebrew letters, Sheen and so on. Now, they relate in this way. In the very center, we have what we call the mother letters, the mothers. There are the letters, the Hebrew letters, are divided by the mothers, the 3 mothers, which are associated with elements, and by the 7 doubles, which are associated with planets, and by the rest of them, which are singles, and they add up to the total number of Hebrew letters. They're placed in this way. The 3 mothers, air, fire, and water, are in the center. The 7 doubles, which represent the planets, are in the second row out. And the 12 singles, which represent the 12 signs of the zodiac, are out here. So a sigil is made by connecting the Hebrew consonants of the name of the angel in order, because all divine angelic beings of the macrocosm are accessed from within the human microcosm. They're going to be evoked. The consonants we have, the are E with an aleph and an L. And so we connect it like this. Here's G, B, and then we have the, I'm sorry, we have to go backward. There's G, B, R, and now we have the aleph, and then we have the final L. And this becomes a sigil for the angel Gabriel, and will be used in magical things. And this is that's what the use of some of these things is. The Hermetic cross is a very famous thing we find in magical tradition. So here we have our Rosicrucian cross with the rose in the center and 4 directions and the different planets and all this sort of thing. A Hermetic cross is laid out in this way here. Does anybody knows anything about astrology? You can tell me about what those signs have in common in each of the.
Well, you have the dual signs on the
Right. And that's the way it's ordered, with the sun in the center. And this made a sigil for the craftsmen who did the first, a lot of them who did the first printing of Rosicrucian and other highly symbolic books that had did the engraving for this sort of thing. And you can see it, this Hermetic cross watermark of the early printers who attributed their craft to Hermes. And these were the Albigensians and the Rosicrucian craftsmen. Looks like that. That's how they made their sigil. That's how they made their mark, and it was based on the Hermetic cross.